Nick believes China's future could be as bright as its past in growth terms, but policy choices by China's leadership are preventing that continued success and, in fact, are contributing instead to the current downturn. I will let Nick make the full argument, but this is an important marker, which I hope people in Beijing and Shanghai and the Jedi Knights of the Chinese private economy will hear, that their leadership is making a conscious policy choice that is driving down productivity growth in China. And this is not a whim, and this is not a momentary change, and this is not because they suddenly stopped manipulating their currency and exporting. This is because of domestic choices made by the Chinese leadership, starting with President Xi. And this is reversible. It is also an important message from Nick Lardy to hear this at a time when the U.S. government is getting ever more hyped up about the potential dangers of Chinese trade, of Chinese technological competition, and in which we're having a public debate about, did we blow it with China? Did we assume too much convergence? Was it really not the market? As my friend Chris Padilla from IBM said 6 months ago when we had a China event here, you know, we spent a lot of years arguing that in Japan and Korea and the former Soviet Union and earlier China, state-led capitalism doesn't work. Why are we suddenly believing it now? Well, this isn't Nick's main message, but it's a message I want you to take away. It still doesn't work. And state-led capitalism in China is hurting China and the world. It was the private sector in China, as Nick and other scholars established, and as the Chinese people themselves did, that led to China's growth. And just as, if I may go beyond Star Wars, just as in the Cold War, speaking for myself, the U.S. got to extreme levels of domestic paranoia at the very time the Soviet Union was failing, it may be a partial repeat that the U.S. government is going crazy over the potential threat from China at just the moment that the Chinese economy is turning on itself. So let us hear out Nick Lardy, think about the facts, the analysis, the assessment, and the implications for all we do. Nick should not need much of an introduction, but he deserves one. Nick is the Anthony M. Solomon Senior Fellow here at the Peterson Institute. He joined the Institute in March 2003 from the Brookings Institution, where he'd been from 1995 to 2003. Previously, he had been at the University of Washington, where, among other titles, he was director of the Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies. He's also been an adjunct professor at Yale University School of Management. This is his fourth book for the Institute. We are always very proud to have a book by Nick Lardy and have Nick with us. One final image. If it's a trilogy like Star Wars, maybe we can look forward to a book, The Return of the Market, in a few years. And that will be a book I will be proud to publish by Nick Lardy. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Adam, for that very fulsome introduction. Appreciate it, and I thank all of you for coming to hear my views on The State Strikes Back. I should tell you, originally my working title was Medium-Term Potential Growth in China. But you probably wouldn't have come to hear that. Two main themes emerged from the book. As Adam said, that state companies are dragging down China's economic growth. And I think China's potential growth, with a return to the market, as we saw, for the third part of the trilogy, hopefully, I think China's growth could go back to something above 8%. It's not going to go back to the double digits that we saw in quite a bit of the last 40 years, but I think the potential is well above the 6 point, whatever it is we're seeing now, and what we're likely to see if reform does not begin, which I think will be less favorable. I want to start with the conventional wisdom. You can see two quotes here. I won't read them, but there's certainly a very widespread view that China's growth is slowing down, maybe reversion to the mean to 2% per capita. Lots of people saying, well, China is now a big maturing economy. We expect growth to slow down. It's inevitable. Well, of course, conventional wisdom sometimes proves to be correct, but I'm arguing that it's not preordained, that with a different set of policies, as Adam suggested, China could do substantially better and avoid the 2% scenario that has gotten so much attention. I will review just briefly where we are now on policy. China's approach. Remember the third plenum in November of 13, they talked about, they had a very broad blueprint for reform, and to me that one sentence about the market must be the decisive force in the allocation of resources was the single most important sentence because it had never appeared in a party document before. The reality, I think, is that under Xi Jinping, and starting a little bit earlier, there were some elements of industrial policy before Xi Jinping came to power, but he has doubled down on industrial policy and has expanded the role of state enterprises and is really squeezing out private firms, which were the source of most of the growth of the economy in the first 35 years, starting in 1978. I'm not going to review all the evidence from the rise of the market, but I do think one has to keep in mind that when reform began, all the prices were set by the state. They had no connection with relative scarcity. That all changed. There were no legally operating private firms. That changed a little bit slowly, but now we have, by the 1990s, we had fairly strong growth and a much better legal environment for private firms. And there was a substantial growth of credit to private firms as well. It was very, very little in the 80s. It grew in the 90s. This data series doesn't start until 2010, but you can see 2010 to 13, about half of all the credit going to non-financial corporates was going to private companies, and only roughly about a third was flowing to state-controlled companies. Perhaps not surprisingly, as I'll mention in a minute, private firms had much higher return on assets. They were more productive. They were getting better access to credit. And so you can see in the black line the share of investment undertaken by private firms was rising steadily in this period before Xi Jinping came to power, and the share being undertaken by state firms was declining. So it's a combination of more productive private firms and reasonable access to credit by private companies. We can also see the rise of the market in what I call the displacement of state companies, and this was particularly noticeable in the industrial sector, where you can see here, if you go back to 78, the vast majority of output was being produced by state companies. Most of the rest was produced by collective firms, which were frequently under the control, if not the ownership, of local governments. So basically everything was state, and the state share steadily declined. By the time we get to 2011, the share being produced by state companies is down to 26%. 26% of 2011 output is a lot bigger than 80% of 1978 output, but there was a displacement in gradual terms in which private firms became more and more important, and the role of state firms systematically declined. One final indicator that is worth noting is looking at the source of Chinese exports. You go back to the mid-90s, the vast majority of Chinese exports were being produced by state firms. Now we're down to something in the neighborhood of 10 or 11%. Foreign invested firms initially took up most of the slack, rising to produce about half of China's exports. They've declined a bit over the last 10 years, and private firms have become the dominant source of growth of Chinese exports. So whether you're looking at output or exports, investment, what we see is a very concerted rise of the private sector. I probably should have had a slide on employment. Almost all the growth of employment over this period was also due to the rise of private firms. Now, what's new? Well, I think there's been a very substantial rollback in the role of the market, particularly since 2013, although, as I indicated, there are some indicators of it even earlier. You can see it in bank credit. You can see it in the share of investment. You can see it in the growth of output in the industrial sector. And I think it's also important to look at the anti-competitive mergers that occurred in this period as well. So first, bank credit. Amazingly, private firms, which are getting a little over half of all the credit by 2016, were down to about 11%, and you had this explosion of credit, the share of credit going to the state sector. And this is the flow of credit to non-financial corporations. So I'm not looking at lending to households for mortgages and things like that. We're just looking at the flow of credit to non-financial corporations. The state share went up dramatically from about a third to a little bit more than 80%. And keep in mind, as we all know, I don't really need to remind you, but I'll say it anyway, this is a period in which total credit was growing extremely rapidly. And despite the rapid growth of credit, by 2016, the flow of credit to private companies was about 620 billion RMB. In 2013, it was 2.6 trillion. So not only did their share of credit go down dramatically, even the absolute amount of credit flowing to the private sector was reduced, even as its share of output was growing. Well, you won't be surprised then to see the change that occurred in the share of investment being undertaken by state and private firms. Remember, the private ones were going up fairly robustly up around through around 2011 or 12. Then it begins to plateau off. In the last couple of years, we have a decline. We don't have the data yet for 2018, but judging from the kind of indicators that one looks at, I think the share of investment by private companies probably fell a little bit more in 2018. The state share went up. You may, if you look carefully, you'll see the state share went up by a bit more than the private sector went down. That's because the state also took over some investment by collective firms and by foreign firms. So this is a fairly large discontinuity in my view. You have a rather continuous shrinking in the share of private investment, state investment for almost a decade, and now we are on an upturn. So that's the third indicator. So the bank credit is the first, the share of investment, no, this is the second one. The third one is on industrial output. And I showed you the continuous decline in the share of output being produced by state firms, and that was because state firms were growing at about half the pace of private firms. Let's say the data here start in 2005, running through about 2014. But as you can see, in the last few years, there's been a rather dramatic change. The growth of state firms has increased significantly, and the growth of private firms has slumped off a little bit. So now state firms are growing more rapidly than the private firms in the industrial sector. We don't have absolutely perfect data going back to the late 1970s, but I believe the last 2 or 3 years are probably the only period since reform began 40 years ago that state industrial firms are growing more rapidly than private firms. Now, I also want to look at one more element in the shrinkage of the market and the reduction in the role of market forces, and that is the mergers that are being undertaken by large state companies. These large state companies, they're not really companies, they're conglomerates. They're holding companies that are under the control of the State-Owned Asset Supervision and Administration Commission, or as we all call it for those of us that follow China, SASAC. SASAC began with 196 of these holding companies, but they controlled about a fourth of all the firms in China. Many of these holding companies had dozens and dozens, and in some cases, hundreds of subsidiaries. So this is a massive part of the economy. And what SASIC started orchestrating soon after it was created was to merge these large group companies. There was a hiatus on this for a few years, and then it restarted up in about the middle of 2015. And if you just look at the names of the companies, you'll see that they are merging firms that are basically in the same industries. So whether they're shipbuilding firms or rail car producers or in the trading business or in the metals business, they're merging them together. And I think the safest thing, I said it's anti-competitive. I think in many of these cases, you had oligopolistic market structures to start with, and they were converted into something much closer to monopolistic structures with a lot of market power. By today, they're down to around 90-some firms. So they basically cut the number of firms in half by merging. Well, what's the result? Well, this is a diagram that I think tells us several things. First of all, even though there are half as many firms as there used to be, their assets have gone from a little bit less than 11 trillion RMB up to almost 55 trillion RMB, so there's been a huge expansion. They're not really that profitable. If you add up all the profits in this period, this is pre-tax profits, add up all the profits, subtract the 25% corporate income tax, retained earnings could have financed only about 1/5 of the expansion of assets that occurred over this period. So these firms are getting very substantial access to bank credit. They have access to the corporate bond market. They have access to the equity market. So they've raised a very substantial amount of money. But what has happened? What has happened to the return on assets? It's gone from around 6-7% down basically to 2.5%. So the productivity of these firms as measured by return on assets has declined dramatically. And this is one of the reasons I think growth is below potential. If they had maintained returns like they had at the beginning of the period before these mergers started, China would have been growing a lot more rapidly. So the decline in the return on assets, I think, reflects the fact that once you've merged, you might think, well, they've got more market power. Why don't they raise prices and become hugely profitable? That's not what happened. I think the incentive for innovation was undermined, the incentive for cost control was undermined, and the opportunity for corruption was substantially increased. If you read the detailed studies of these huge conglomerates with hundreds of subsidiaries, the people at the top are shifting resources across the subsidiaries. There's tons of related party transactions, no bid contracts, and the money just evaporates. Anti-competitive mergers are one of the additional pieces of evidence on undermining the role of the market. I'll just give you one last data slide, which is looking at just at the industrial sector where we have the best data, and looking again at return on assets of state versus private companies. And this slide too has a lot of interesting aspects. If you go back and think, state companies were not doing very well in the second half of the 90s. Zhu Rongji led a very profound transformation of the industrial sector, particularly of state companies, downsizing them in some cases, requiring them to exit in other cases. And of course, this was the period in which China was cutting its tariffs in order to qualify for membership in the WTO. Second half of the 90s, they cut their tariffs on average from about 60% down to 10%. And so competition was increasing. And what happened? The productivity of state firms improved fairly dramatically from up until around 2007. Well, I think the reforms of cutting tariffs and the reforms of the state-owned enterprise restructuring, they had significant effects, but they weren't going to continue indefinitely. And as I mentioned before, reforms slowed down a bit under Hu Jintao, Wen Jiabao. And so 2007, I guess the closest they came to converging to private companies is around 2005 or 6. But since then, you can see a tremendous gap has opened up, and the productivity of private firms is something like 3.5 times that of state companies. It's not the case that private firms just sailed through the global financial crisis, and that China had strong growth for a couple of years, but their growth has tapered off a bit. But the multiple of private firm productivity above state firm productivity has actually expanded because the decline in the productivity of state firms has been, in relative terms, much larger. So 2 final slides, and I hope we'll have a lot of time for discussion. I try to make a kind of back-of-the-envelope estimate of how much growth China has lost because of the declining productivity of state companies and the squeezing out of investment by more efficient private firms. And I do something very simple. I ask the counterfactual question, well, how much greater would have been, let's say, in 2015 or 2016, if this productivity gap had not opened up? How much larger would output be? How much larger would value added be? And then ask the next question, okay, what rate of growth would you have had to reach that higher endpoint? And there's some uncertainties because of limitations on data, particularly for the service sector, but my estimate is they would have grown anywhere between 1.6 and 2 full percentage points more rapidly if we had not had this decline in the productivity of state companies and the squeezing out of investment by more efficient private companies. Well, my basic view is that potential is still there. If you had the right set of reforms, which are discussed at some length in the book, but I'm not going to go into this afternoon, if you had the right set of reforms, I think you could gain that extra 1.5 or 2 percentage points of growth. And I say that in part based on, whoops, I went the wrong way. Based in part on the general idea of convergence. Remember, I said at the outset, a lot of people are saying, well, China's a mature, high-income economy. You can't expect it to grow fast forever. But it's still only at about 1/4 of the U.S. level. That is roughly the level that a lot of other successful East Asian economies began a period of rapid growth that lasted for a couple of decades and brought them up to anywhere between 50 and 70% of the U.S. level. And I think, to me, one of the most striking things, and I can't remember, maybe it's in a footnote. So they've already been growing for 40 years at 9 point something, and they're only at 25% of the U.S. level. In 1978, when reform began, they were at 5% of the U.S. level. So China's rapid growth began from a much, much lower base than other East Asian modernizers. I think the potential for convergence to something well above 25% of the U.S. level remains, but it will take a very different approach in terms of economic policy than what we've seen under Xi Jinping. In the last chapter of the book, we go back and forth and look at, what are the reasons Xi might revert to, so I could write the third book in the trilogy. What are the forces that are leading him in this direction? And I'm a bit agnostic, and that's why in the subtitle of the book, I do have a question mark. I think China's growth is not foreordained. It will be a consequence of the kinds of policy choices that are made under Xi Jinping and hopefully his successors. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. Nick, that was fantastic, of course. We've got a great audience on the record. We will open it up for questions, but let me ask you to expand on a couple of things you didn't cover. One point which is very much out there in the contemporary discourse is the idea that China has a huge financial crisis brewing, that there's a debt problem, and that people who argue that might look at your chart about the declining share of private sector bank lending and say that actually is to some degree voluntary on the part of the private sector or a response to the debt problems, not to Xi Jinping's reallocation priorities. How do you respond to that other interpretation of the debt picture than what you put out there, and whether the debt is the major force at present?
Well, a couple of preliminary points. First, it's very common to look at debt to GDP, and China, of course, has been shooting up on that metric to something in the neighborhood of 250, 260%. But it's also sometimes useful to look at debt relative to equity. And if you look particularly in the industrial sector, debt to equity has not changed since around 2007 or 2008. But if you disaggregate it, it's the state companies where the leverage, as by that measure, has gone up, and private companies are going down. So private companies are more efficient, and they are able to operate with, borrowing. Well, they operate. If you earn 10% return on assets and you're borrowing at 6%, it's not hard to make it's not hard to get your debt to equity ratio down. If you're borrowing at 6% and your returns are 2 point something, you're going to be in trouble eventually, and that's what's happened in China. So it's not a general question of debt; it's a question of credit allocation and where it's going. Now, your part of your question was, well, maybe private firms are voluntarily deciding to scale back on their borrowing. Certainly, that's a possibility. It's an interesting hypothesis I've thought about, and unless I did a big survey of hundreds of thousands, there are 10 million firms in China, most of which are private. The big ones are all state. What I look at is what Xi Jinping talked about. Remember, I mentioned he approved and was involved in the approval of a very far-reaching reform program in the fall of 2013. But he didn't ever really implement very much of it. He was concerned about his anti-corruption campaign, maybe getting rid of some of his enemies, so at the next party Congress they could vote to eliminate the term limits on the office of president. But he also, when he did talk about state companies, he kept saying state companies must be bigger. That was a steady drumbeat from Xi Jinping, and it still goes on, that state companies must be bigger. And at the local level, there are a lot of inefficient state companies, and local political leaders are leaning on city commercial banks to lend more money to state companies, and the share of lending by these city commercial banks has been skyrocketing. The data are in the book. So I think that the message from the top political leader was not that we need to make state companies more efficient and enforce bankruptcy and credit worthiness standards, but rather they must be big. And so, as you could see, for the universe of firms under Central SASIC, they have a five-fold increase in their assets in a relatively short period of time, primarily by getting access to this credit. Now, I'm going on too long, but one additional footnote on this is, as the diagram on credit, you probably couldn't read all the footnotes, but that's basically bank credit coming from banks, credit cooperatives, foreign banks. As bank credit was curtailed to the private sector, they began to borrow from the non-bank financial institutions, or so-called shadow banking. So they weren't cut off quite as badly as the bank credit diagram would suggest, but we don't have good data on lending by ownership for the shadow banking sector. But when they decided that there was an accumulation of financial risk in 2016, which I think of access to shadow banking.
Another question, just to flesh out your analysis a bit. It's in the book, The State Strikes Back. Buy it now for Valentine's Day. Is obviously, for data reasons, you were very focused in your presentation on the industrial sector, and we have great difficulty measuring profits and productivity in the services sector as well in this country. But as you pointed out in Markets Over Mao and other places, the service sector is becoming more private over time and is taking a larger and larger share of the Chinese economy over time. So to the degree you can, how do you see your argument playing out in the services sector? Or is President Xi, like Trump, just obsessed with manufacturing?
Well, the Chinese do publish data on productivity in the service sector. In the industrial sector, state firm productivity as measured by return on assets has declined by about 2/3. Eve of global financial crisis up to 2016. For service sector firms, the decline is about 40%, so it's not quite as extreme. The catch is we don't have very good data on private service sector productivity. I have a table on comparing state and private based on an economic census, but it's from some years ago. But that showed that the differential was roughly 2 to 1, that private service sector firms are twice as efficient as state ones. So I think there is a gap, and the gap has widened as productivity of state service sector firms has gone down. And I think partly it's, private firms have gotten more access, more and more subsectors and components of services have been opened up, but there are still substantial portions, aviation, where there's just a small private sector, basic telecom services, which is 100% state-owned, and so forth. So private firms have made more headway in displacing state companies in the industrial sector than they have in the service sector.
Finally, before I open it up, Nick, one of the things you mentioned, which is indeed covered in the book, is the issue of what reforms need to go on to restore China back on its strong growth path. And you taught us, and many of us, looked at the third-party plenum of 2013 statement as the sort of apex of reform promises in recent years, and it's all been downhill since there. In light of what your assessment, if the leadership of China decided to change beyond stop saying the word bigger is better, what to you would be the key reform agenda?
Well, I think the key reform agenda, we learned from the past, from the Zhu Rongji reforms in the second half of the 90s, one of the key reforms is to require underperforming firms to exit or to allow their assets to be acquired by more efficient firms. The Chinese acknowledge this is a big problem. I have a table in there that shows that about 44% of all state companies lose money. They don't just lose money cyclically, they lose money year after year after year, and the amount of money they're losing is the most recent data is 8 times what it was prior to the global financial crisis. So these are, and that's after they receive a lot of direct subsidies. So how do they survive? Well, they borrow more and more money from the state banking system. So we need to have reforms that the firms that do not generate returns sufficient to pay for the cost of capital need to shrink or exit. So, but China has very little bankruptcy. I've got some data in the book you can look at. The number of firms that go through bankruptcy is teeny. The amount of merger and acquisition activity that's kind of bottom up as opposed to this top-down moving the chess pieces from Beijing, as I showed you in one of the slides, the kind of bottom-up market-oriented merger and acquisition activity is very small. So assets don't get reallocated from less to more productive uses, and I think that's really fundamental to reversing this long-term decline in the productivity of state firms.
Terrific, Nick. Thank you very much. I'm now going to open it up to questions and comments. Just to recap for people, there's a standing mic at the back. If you're near the back, please go stand by it if you can. There's a traveling mic in Jessica's hands at the front. When I recognize you, please identify yourself, and please, no matter how brilliant you are, make it a question, not a speech. So at the back mic, please.
Thanks very much. It was wonderful.
Sorry, could you identify yourself,
Yeah, Uli
please?
Darush with the Policy Center for the New South and Google. Nick, that was wonderful. I have 2 quick questions, just questions. One is, what are the causes of the state striking back, and are they likely to persist? That's the first question. The second question is, if the public sector, the SOEs are only 30% as productive as the private sector, why are we in trade negotiations so worried about the SOEs? Maybe the SOEs are good news for us. Thank you.
I like that.
Yeah. On the causes, I think, quite frankly, that Xi Jinping's priority is not economic reform, but political control, and he believes that a larger state sector gives him more control. Now, whether, I presume he has an accurate assessment of that. I don't want to second guess on that. So there's obviously some sort of trade-off. If you're going to allow markets to have a greater role and the influence of the state to wane, he is picking a point on this continuum that has a lot more emphasis on state and control. I think that's the most plausible explanation of why they're going down this road. There's some people who believe that he really is desperately anxious to push his reform agenda, and he's being thwarted by vested interests in various places, the big state enterprises and the political leaders at the local level who don't want to go down the road that I just described. And I think that's an equally plausible hypothesis, and I don't think these two hypotheses are mutually exclusive. He wants to have control, and the vested interests don't want the kind of reform program that would undermine control. So you could say there's a congruence of interests and approach between the two groups. So that would be my simple explanation. And I couldn't agree with you more than the premise of your second question. I should have mentioned it when I had that slide up on the results of the SASIC merger program. This is the longest standing Chinese industrial policy. My data only went back to, I can't remember, 2005. By the way, all the data in that table are published by SASIC. But when SASIC, Zhang Yaqing or whatever his name is, when he goes to places and talks about his firms, he only talks about top-line growth. I heard him at the Boao Forum last year, 26 trillion RMB in revenue. We are powerful. And it went up another 10% this year. He never talks about return on assets or efficiency, innovation, or anything. He's always top-line growth. It's easy to grow your top line if you have what seems to be unlimited access to credit and you don't care what the returns are. So that's the longest standing industrial policy, and I think it has been a catastrophic failure. Returns have gone from 6-7% to 2.5%. It's an enormous waste of resources. Now, maybe the $100 billion they're spending on the semiconductor industry will succeed brilliantly, and they were going to overtake all the Japanese and Korean and U.S. firms, by tomorrow afternoon at the latest. But I can't see that it's happening. I think China in semiconductors is 10 years behind, and there's not much evidence that the gap is closing. Some people argue that it's fairly constant or actually expanding. Now, that doesn't mean that in some domains they might be able to pursue policies that are very successful. But in general, I think the emphasis on state-led growth has led to declining efficiency and relatively unfavorable outcomes.
Okay. Could you go to the back mic, please? I'm pointing you, the gentleman, yes, you, sorry. I'm not supposed to point, but sorry.
Hi, I'm Wayne Morrison with the Congressional Research Service, and this follows the last question. As an economist, I would say, well, I don't care if China wastes its money and throws it away, but as somebody who works for Congress, there's huge concern now on how China's industrial policies may be affecting U.S. industries. And of course, we have this little trade war with China over the Section 301 case. So I was wondering if, Nick, if you could comment on whether you think that the U.S. needs to confront China on some of these industrial policies, and if so, what should we be doing to get them to move more toward markets, and whether you see China as a sort of a big competitive threat, just because their ability to subsidize their industries and what they could do to such U.S. semiconductor industries and others who face challenges from non-market behavior.
Well, thank you for the question. I think several things. I think, first of all, if you look at one of the tables in the book, I showed you the data on the losses of state-owned companies, and I mentioned earlier it's 8 times what it used to be. pre-global financial crisis. As a share of GDP, it's doubled. So that's data published by the Chinese Ministry of Finance, and so I think we should be going after them and saying, you have to have a plan for not eliminating this immediately, but scaling it back very substantially over time, so you don't have this systematic distortion. On the other hand, here we have 40% of these companies losing money, getting access to credit and stay in business. I still don't think they're very competitive in the international markets because their share of exports has gone from, whatever that diagram showed, 70, 80% down to 10%. So yes, they're getting subsidized. Yes, it's a potential distortion, but they are so inefficient that their share of China's exports has actually gone down. So I think we should press them for reducing those subsidies. I'm not sure how high a price we're paying in the short run from the fact that they've had these subsidies for a long, long period of time. Secondly, I think we should be pushing for an expansion of the number of sectors in which there are no caps on foreign ownership. This, I think, is the best way to limit the forced technology transfer. If you have a wholly owned company, you can take whatever steps, same steps that you would take in any other market to protect your technology. That doesn't mean you're not vulnerable. You could have employees who run off with thumb drives with all your best stuff, or you could get hacked into, but I mean, those are problems that exist anywhere. So, and what has happened over time is originally, when China began opening up, everybody that invested in China had to be in a joint venture, and technology was automatically flowing. The indigenous partner got access to the technology on day one. Now, about 75% of all investment going into China is in the form of wholly owned companies where the potential for that kind of transfer is reduced. So I think we ought to be pushing the Chinese, in other words, instead of saying, what we're asking for, is, at least as I hear it, and it's very blurry, or it's not exactly very crisp, instead of talking about, you're living in sin, you have to change, we ought to be asking for a reduction in the number of sectors where you have to enter in a joint venture. And the Chinese are moving in that direction. They have eliminated the foreign caps on electric vehicles production. So Tesla has its facility now that it's hoping to have production up and running by later this year. They are eliminating the joint venture requirements for conventional automobiles in 2021. They've eliminated or reduced the caps, or I guess I should say raise the caps for a whole, for asset management, securities, insurance, banking, and most of those foreign ownership caps are going to be phased out over the next 2 to 3 years. So they're moving in the right direction. So I think we ought to be asking for more concrete things like reducing subsidies, getting rid of, as much as possible, the foreign ownership caps for foreign direct investment. Now, they're never going to agree to everything. They're not going to allow, the Chinese Communist Party propaganda department is going to keep control of the media. They're not going to allow independent television stations or radio stations or newspapers. So we're probably going to just have to cave on that. But in other sectors, particularly in services, which are still the most restrictive, they ought to be phasing out those caps.
Just to thank you very much, Wayne, for the question. It's very important. Just to channel a few of our other colleagues here who work on the trade and investment and tech issues. I mean, I think one message a lot of our team would give you, and for you to take back in your mission to educate Congress, is to be picking the issues on the basis of the nature of the technology, and less about subsidies in China. I mean, it may well be, or on IPR enforcement, qua IPR enforcement, not on the fact that somebody out there competes with us in an industry. And for obvious reasons, this stuff all gets conflated. And there is very legitimate, we published a nice paper by Lee Brandstetter a few months ago on this topic. Chad Bound testified before the US-China Commission on this. There's very good reason you can argue about, say, with Internet of Things or with networked effects, that there's reason for a national security intervention. But it's not about the subsidies. it's about the nature of the technology. And I think, as Gary Huffbauer and Martin Chorzempa and Nick have tried to emphasize, if you're going to be reimposing the export control regime and you're going to be building up CFIUS the way that the Congress has mandated you do, then at least have an expert discussion about what specific technologies are the ones to worry about, and have a transparent, coherent process for determining those, which is both technological and national security. But speaking as an economist, as you are, the subsidy stuff and the idea that they're just going to, the Chinese, are just going to take over whole industries and put everyone out of business, and then we can't do anything. If they cheat their way to being on top, then we can cheat our way back and reverse engineer them too. I mean, it's just, there's a lot, I mean, seriously, if you know, this all assumes all kinds of weird things. I know that's not the position you were pushing. I want to be very clear. I'm just saying that take Nick's trenchant analysis of China and use it to focus on what delivers for American security and not so much on China qua China. Another question or comment? Please. Jessica, right here in front. Thank you.
Scott Kennedy. Scott Kennedy with CSIS. I was trying to be as empathetic with Xi Jinping as possible, and trying to think about what type of economic logic might be directing him. And I was wondering, is it possible that SOEs are still primarily providing public goods, and therefore their return on assets and things are going to be lower than private companies, and maybe a big infrastructure push, and therefore that's why they're trending downward and such a big gap between them and private companies. So but if it's not that, then maybe it's just that the reforms that you suggest they undertake would be so difficult and wouldn't be so simple. Perhaps it might lead to a financial crisis, or make it so that private companies couldn't get capital, or local governments, and so maybe they're just stuck, and that they'd like to do what you'd want to say, but doing that has just got too much risk in it. So do you see any logic behind what they're doing economically, or an economic logic why they wouldn't embrace reform?
Okay. First, on the public goods. It is true there are some public services that provided by state companies that are likely to be money losing, and that might affect return on assets. But I would differentiate between the cross-section comparison and the time comparison. Since the return on assets of state companies has gone down by roughly 2/3, it can't possibly be mostly explained by a huge increase in the provision of public goods. Second, I like the example of subways, because at least I drive to work every day, but I hope the subways are heavily subsidized so the traffic is less. And pollution is less. Now, it's a fact, if you read the rules of the Ministry of Finance, subsidies go above the line. And the subway systems I've been able to find data for, they have an operating loss, they have a huge subsidy, and they show profits. So, that doesn't prove anything, but at least in that domain, it looks like, the buildup of the subway system in many, many cities over the last 10 years probably has not dragged down the return on assets of state companies. They're all on the Chinese accounting rules. They're mostly, at least the ones I can find, are profitable. The difficulty question I do address, and of course I start out by looking at how big is the state sector in terms of employment, because the main difficulty for undertaking these reforms of state-owned enterprises is obviously the downsizing, the exit, and so forth, that maybe is going to leave a lot of people without jobs. And the problem today is very much less than it was in the late 1990s when Zhu and Ji, got rid of about 30 million or 25 to 35 million people, almost entirely from the state sector. There are only 40 million people working, or roughly 40 million people working for state companies. Of course, it's a huge number, but it's about 11% of the workforce, and as a share of total workforce, it's much, much less than it was in the 1990s. So, and in the 1990s, they had, I think, a reasonably successful program. People that were close to retirement got early retirement. People that were unemployed got extra length unemployment insurance. They had retraining programs. They had special unemployment centers. And I think they were able to fairly rapidly re-employ most of the people that were, in this period when they were laying off all these workers, total employment expanded by 60 million. So it was, you know, I'm sure there are a few people that fell between the cracks, but I think the system was basically working. So you have a much smaller share of the population employed in the state sector. There are steps you can take to ameliorate the, you know, the social consequences. So I don't think it's as difficult as sometimes thought. I will say, yes, and this is maybe goes to Xi Jinping's thinking, you probably are going to have a downturn in economic growth. You know, not all these assets get redeployed instantaneously. Not all these workers that might lose their job are going to be reemployed instantaneously. So you could have a period of somewhat slower growth. So probably he doesn't want to undertake this kind of a reform in the current environment where growth is already slowing down. They should have done it, you know, back in the days of double-digit growth, but they didn't. Remember, the fastest period of economic growth in China was the 2000s, the first decade of the 2000s. Well, that was when they were gaining the benefit of all the increased competition from the downsizing of the state sector, joining, you know, reducing tariffs to come into the WTO. And, you know, Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, the party secretary and the premier in that period, or most of that period, I think made a fundamental mistake. I think their view was, wow, we're growing at more than 10%. Why should we undertake any reforms? But, you know, those reforms weren't going to generate super rapid growth forever. So they should have, more reforms should have been done in that period. I think now it's a more challenging environment.
Another, please, could I ask you to make your way to the standing mic?
Rich Miller with Bloomberg. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the current situation in China, especially about the concerns that the growth there is slowing a lot more sharply than the official statistics, and also maybe comment about the steps they've taken to support the economy. I guess one could argue that some of the steps they've taken are in the direction of more private sector, market-oriented, and less towards the sort of steps that they took like in 2008, 2007, which seemed much more reliant on the state and on public expenditure, et cetera. Thank you.
Well, first on the question of, you know, do the official data substantially overstate the pace of growth? Is the slowdown much more severe? You know, the official data show 6.8 in the first quarter last year, then it was 6.7, then it was 6.5, then it was 6.4, and for the whole year, year over year, is 6.6. You know, even some, well, I don't know them personally, and I don't know their backgrounds, but some people that get a lot of publicity for talking about this are saying the growth is 1 point something something. I'm basically very skeptical. I think the data of the Chinese measurement of their output is far from perfect. I don't think it is falsified. And I've always believed that it is relatively easy for Chinese to keep track of imports of goods. I'm not talking about services, which might be finagled a little more easily. But through the first 10 months of this year, 2018, imports were growing at over 15%. Now, it fell way off in November and December, but if you have import growth of 15%, they're growing closer to 20%. It's 15% for the whole year. If imports are growing at 15%, I cannot believe, and that's just goods, I cannot believe that GDP growth is 2 or 3 or 4%. It's got to be much higher than that. So growth is slowing, and it slowed quite a bit in the fourth quarter. And why is growth slowing? It's mostly because net exports of goods and services were a big drag on China's growth last year. And its exports were not going down. Exports were 10% last year. but import growth was so much stronger. So if you look at just domestic demand was stronger in 18 than it was in 17 by a substantial margin. Now, why did net exports of goods and services drag down China's growth? Well, we're going to have to wait and see. Maybe exports were strong because of companies in the United States trying to get ahead of the tariffs, and now that the tariffs haven't gone up yet, and they probably have high inventories, maybe we'll have very weak export growth in the first quarter or two of 2019. So growth could slow a lot more in the first couple of quarters, but I don't think it slowed dramatically last year, and I think domestic demand was quite strong.
Nick, can I just
7.1%.
Can I just ask you, when you say slow quite a bit but not that much, I mean, just so you're saying something that goes into the mid-5s, something goes into mid-4s, what order of magnitude?
I'm not a forecaster, but if they grew at 6.6 last year, I think they will grow at 6.2, 6.3 this year. I think growth will come down. There's plenty of evidence that employment growth is weakening, particularly in the export sector. And if export growth, if tariffs go up and export growth weakens further, then they could lose more. I think the best estimate, in a full-fledged tariffs on everything at 25%, you could take off another 0.5 percentage point. The Chinese could offset part of that. But what I'm saying is just in the current dynamic, they may be going down to 6.3. In a worsening of the tariff war, maybe you go to 6.
Just to repeat the second part of Rich's question, he was saying about, Rich, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you were saying, aren't they taking some stimulus measures now that could be seen as broadly supportive of the private sector? Is that correct? What do you think about that?
They are taking some stimulus measures, but so far they're fairly modest. I think China is in a very difficult situation. They have had some success in deleveraging. By the end of last year, credit growth was the slowest it had been in over a decade. They're trying to bring down credit to GDP, and it has plateaued and inched down very slightly. So at this point, they're loath to give up those gains by all of a sudden having a very expansive monetary policy that would expand credit rapidly. So they're trying to do more on the fiscal side. They're doing some modest tax cuts. They promised to do more. They're doing a little bit on the monetary side. But I suspect that they're looking at the data week by week and month by month to see how much the economy is really likely slowing down. And I think worst case, they will eventually adopt a more expansionary monetary policy. I think there's some real constraints on the fiscal side that I don't need to go into, but they don't have, well, let me just say, in the US, what we wanted a stimulus, we cut personal income tax. Only 15% of the population in China pays any personal income tax. And the revenue that is collected accounts for something like 5 or 6% of total tax revenue. So, they can cut the VAT tax, and that reduces the burden on firms, and then maybe firms keep the money, or maybe they lower the prices a little bit. So it seems to me it's a little bit more of an indirect passage from going from a VAT tax cut to try to stimulate the economy. So they're certainly concerned. They're watching it very closely. They've done something on the fiscal side. Cuts last year were equal to about 1.3% of GDP, cutting the VAT taxes. And they also reformed the personal income tax so that the threshold below which you didn't have to pay personal income tax was raised quite a bit. So they're doing some things on the fiscal side, and I think they'll do more on the monetary side if the need arises.
Okay. Another question, please, here in front.
Hello, Lila Foss from Toyota. Given the evidence that the wonderful presentation you gave, it seems like the Chinese private firms would actually appreciate the U.S. efforts or other countries' efforts to sort of influence this reforms within China, particularly the subsidy reforms. I'd be curious about your thoughts on that. And secondly, we've seen in Europe and the U.S. this sort of chatter about antitrust, just given how large tech firms are becoming. And one of the arguments against that approach is the fact that if Western companies can't grow big, they can't really compete against their Chinese counterparts. However, some of your data doesn't look like they're their own worst enemy when it comes to competition. But just from a broader perspective, your views on an industrial policy in China beyond just the SAC and potential industrial policy in the U.S. to compete in the future.
Well, first, I certainly share your view that there are some in China, certainly some economists and some people in the private sector that think external pressure would help to get China back on the reform path. I don't want to take that argument too far because I think it's not a linear relationship, and once you get beyond some point, I don't know exactly where it is, it becomes more and more difficult for Xi Jinping to compromise. So I'm a little reluctant to push that line too hard. And again, going back to the previous question, they did do some things to try to address the problem of credit in the private sector. But given the starting point where most of the credit is now coming from the formal banking system, and in the most recent data we have, which unfortunately do lag, 4/5 of it is going to state companies. It's going to take a long time to get back to where we were. And some of the targeted measures that they have deal with give incentives to lend to smaller firms, including what they call micro-sized firms, which is a smaller category that they introduced a few years ago. But there are a lot of state companies, even in the small and micro-sized categories. So emphasizing small and micro for targets of lending doesn't necessarily lead to much of an increase in lending to the private sector. It'll depend on the details. Competition, I couldn't agree with you more. I think this argument that you should kind of relax, the anti-monopoly provisions, particularly in Europe where it's being discussed so much, so that they can compete more efficiently with Chinese firms, I think is a terrible idea. And you could see the data on the kinds of firms that are, there are some successful firms in this universe of SASIC. I don't want to say that they're all failing or anything like that. I mean, they're all they're all making enough money to cover the cost of capital with returns of 2.5%. But the trajectory is what's alarming. As I said before, I think anyone who thinks that China has got the secret sauce to have industrial policy that succeeds brilliantly should look at the performance of this group of firms.
Is there, yes, please.
Nick, good to see you. James Rowland, Ford Motor Company. Picking up on your comment, notwithstanding the announced reforms in the auto equity rules, there was a series of stories about just over a year ago about actually the merger of 3 of the largest state-owned auto companies that would have produced a behemoth of an auto company, big global company. Any update on that and any thoughts of staying away from auto, potentially, given that it's so in the focus right now of the trade negotiations?
Well, I think the auto sector has, over time become more and more competitive. Foreign firms still have a very large market share, but it's come down a bit. There are lots of domestic entrants, even in electric vehicles, so I think it's a more and more competitive industry. I haven't followed in detail the merger that you mentioned, so I don't know that that's reshaping the terrain in the auto sector. I think obviously the sector has been highly profitable and has encouraged a lot of entrants. They obviously have huge excess capacity even before the recent slowdown in sales. So I think it's going to be a pretty tough few years going forward in the automobile industry in China.
Yes, please.
Thank you, John Mullen, McClarty Associates. The very ambitious objectives of Made in China 2025, is that exclusively an industrial policy, or is it seen that the private sector would play a role in achieving those objectives?
Again, looking at it from 35,000 feet, I don't think they're going to achieve most of those objectives in all those industries that they outlined if the private sector is not involved. Because if you looked at that diagram, the share of industrial output being produced by state firms is in 2011 was down to 25%. It continued to decline until the last couple of years it's going up. But remember, a big chunk of that is in metals, steel, and so forth that are not involved in China 2025. So the innovative firms in most of those areas that are outlined in 2025 are mostly private firms. Whether you're talking about AI or other things, it's mostly private firms. So I think that's one of the challenges. How do they, now semiconductors may be, even semiconductors, SMIC is nominally a private firm. It's listed on the stock exchange. Maybe some state governments have a stake in the firm. But how do you coordinate achieving these objectives with state money when many of the key players and many of the domains are private? And I quite frankly think that's one of the misperceptions. I think the view outside of China, and particularly in the US, is, well, you have this big state industrial policy that's pumping resources into state companies, and that's improving, that's enhancing the state sector. But I think eventually they're going to have to rely more on private firms in many of those domains. But they don't seem to want to talk about that.
I guess just to underline that there's no question that in those industries the burden would have to be borne by private sector firms in China. And so just to pick up on Nick's previous comment about the secret sauce, it's not clear, in fact, based on work by Nick and others, there's very little evidence that the huge gains made by the private sector in China were due to direct government subsidization. It wasn't past Chinese industrial policy that created the Chinese miracle. It was Chinese liberalization that created the Chinese miracle. So again, it is entirely possible, if they're incredibly disciplined and foresightful and frankly lucky, that if they give a subsidy to a private sector firm and don't interfere just enough, it will work. Frankly speaking, but once we're into that realm, then we're into the realm that we had between the US and Japan and Korea and various pseudo-national champions in the EU. And whether or not that's an ideal fight, that's sort of in the nature of things. As Nick said, I'm not trying to make apologies for me in China 2025, I'm just trying to make sure that people understand what's involved here. If, as Nick says, it ends up made in China 2025 means more assertion of state control, maybe that will also work, but it hasn't been working for the last 10 years in the places they've done it. We're coming to the end of our time. I can fit in one more question if someone wants to. Sorry, please, if you could walk to the standing mic.
Thank you. I'm Peter Sturm, a retired OECD economist. There's some conventional wisdom that says since the failed revolution at Tiananmen Square, there was a social contract that the government would deliver high economic growth and society would be happy with this and not ask for more civil freedoms. If your predictions are right, that growth is slowing down, do you see?
Well, I certainly agree that there has been that kind of a social contract. I don't think it really emerged entirely after Tiananmen. I think it was partly there before, but maybe it was reinforced by Tiananmen. And when I go through the list of factors that might push Xi to go back to reform in the closing chapter, this factor is one that I highlight. The legitimacy of the party depends on rising living standards, the provision of more services, et cetera, et cetera. And if your growth keeps sliding, your ability to deliver either on the higher personal incomes or better services, whether it's health, education, environment, improved environment, health and safety, will be impaired. But what I can't tell you is, when does that really become binding? After all, 6.6 isn't that shabby. What about 5.6? I don't know at what point Xi Jinping would start thinking, well, maybe this is the time I'm going to have to reintroduce more market forces and give up some control in order to maintain a sufficiently high rate of growth. I don't know where that kicks in, but I think that is one of the more potent factors for eventually convincing him to go back to a more market-oriented reform strategy. Or maybe it won't convince him, it might convince a successor.
So, thank you all for joining us today for the blockbuster premiere of The State Strikes Back by Nicholas Lardy. Nick, it's an honor and a pleasure to have you be the Solomon Fellow here at the Peterson Institute. Thank you very much.